You know, usually when you go into a clinic for a medical diagnosis, there is this like baseline expectation of precision. It feels like engineering
Oh, for
almost.
sure. Yeah.
You fall off a ladder, you break your arm, the doctor puts the x-ray up on the light board, shows you that jagged white line in the bone, points at it and says, there it is, that is the problem.
Right. It is a completely binary situation.
Yeah.
It is either broken or it is not. The evidence is right there in front of you.
Broken or not broken, clean, clear, actionable. Welcome, by the way, to a new session of Reformed Thinking. I invite you to pull up a chair, get comfortable, and join this conversation. Because as clean and clear as a medical x-ray might be, when you step out of the clinic and into the world of geopolitics, national identity, and the spiritual realities driving human conflict, suddenly that x-ray machine just shatters.
Yeah, it really does.
We are looking at a diagnostic landscape today that is honestly incredibly murky. The lines blur for a lot of observers.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. I mean, when people watch the news, the lines between right and wrong, oppressor and oppressed, temporal survival and eternal reality, well, those lines get crossed, smeared, and confused very quickly. Observers want a simple narrative, but human conflict always resists simple narratives.
Which brings us to our mission for today's discussion. We have two very distinct stacks of research in front of us, and honestly, at first glance, they look like they shouldn't even be in the same room.
They really don't.
One stack is raw, on-the-ground sociological data from post-occupation Ukraine. We are talking about the hard numbers on language shifts, destroyed monuments, and civic legislation. And the second stack is a heavy, rigorous theological text. It looks at these exact same historical events, but frames them through the lens of divine providence, human depravity, and the eternal kingdom of God.
Right.
So our goal is to bring these two together. We are going to unpack how words and monuments define a physical nation on a map, and what these earthly, violent struggles reveal about the human soul's desperate need for a heavenly city.
It is a massive undertaking, but a necessary one, I think. We are taking the tangible, earthly data of a society currently in the crucible of war, and we are viewing it through a specific, robust theological framework. We are asking what the visible data from the streets of Eastern Europe tells us about the invisible condition of humanity as a whole.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we can even look at how a wounded national identity is rebuilt, we need to establish why the destruction occurred in the first place.
Right, the root cause.
Yeah, we have to move past the standard television talking points, the stuff about pipelines and buffer zones, and get to the theological root. The secular framing from our first stack of research says the Ukraine-Russia war is a contest over territory, sure, but it goes further. It argues the conflict is fundamentally about the right to narrate a past. The sociological data suggests the invasion is driven by Russia's ideological denial that Ukraine possesses any distinct historical, linguistic, or political life independent of Moscow.
And that sociological source correctly identifies the ideological symptoms. It sees the erasure of history. It sees the denial of a distinct, independent life. But the second source, the theological text, provides the underlying pathology.
Yeah.
This conflict is not a random historical accident, and it is not just a disagreement over a border. The author brings in the Westminster Confession of Faith, specifically Chapter 5, Paragraph 1, which states that God directs, disposes, and governs all creatures and actions by his wise and holy providence. The text also points to Acts 17.26, which declares that God has determined the times appointed and the bounds of the nation's habitations.
Wait, I want to pause right there, because this is a massive claim. We have a secular source saying this is a war over the right to exist as a distinct people. And we have a theological source agreeing with that, but adding that this distinct existence, these specific national borders, are actually ordained by God.
Precisely. And that leads to a very firm rejection of modern secular academic frameworks by the theological author. The text argues that constructs like critical race theory or Marxist intersectionality completely fail to explain the true root of the bloodshed we are seeing.
Because those secular theories try to categorize all human suffering into very modern paradigms, right?
Yes, they do.
Like they want to divide everyone into systemic oppressors and the oppressed based strictly on economics, class, or racial hierarchies.
Yes. The theological text argues those theories strip humanity of moral agency and ignore the fundamental issue of sin. Instead, the author asserts that an unprovoked invasion is a direct manifestation of total depravity.
I'm going to stop you again, because for the listener who isn't spending their weekends reading Puritan theology, total depravity sounds like a horror movie title.
Oh, absolutely does.
It doesn't mean humans are as evil as they could possibly be at every single second of the day, right? It means there's no part of human nature, our mind, our will, our affections, that isn't infected by an underlying selfishness and rebellion against God.
That is a highly accurate clarification. Total depravity means the infection has reached every part of the system. The text quotes Jeremiah 17:9, noting that the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. It also references James 4, which asks a very blunt question. Where do wars and fights come from?
Right.
James answers that they come from the desires for pleasure that war in your members. The unregenerate human heart possesses a relentless lust for dominion. When you take that inherent lust for dominion and you arm it with the machinery of modern state, tanks, artillery, state-run media, you get unprovoked aggression.
I look at it like a massive dam failure. Imagine a town flooded because a colossal concrete dam burst. You have secular theorists standing around in the floodwaters trying to blame the weather patterns, or they are measuring the unexpected volume of rain that week.
Yeah.
But the theological view points out that the concrete of the dam was rotten from the inside out long before the rain ever started. The human heart's inherent sinfulness is the rot. That is what makes tyranny and violence inevitable when the pressure rises.
What is fascinating here is how the source contrasts this robust biblical view with liberal theology. Liberal theology often downplays the severity of original sin and prefers to view humanity as inherently good, but perhaps misguided by bad environments.
So liberal theology assumes if we just give everyone better education and better economic opportunities, we will eventually eradicate war.
Yes, that is the humanistic optimism baked into liberal theology. But the author points out that this worldview completely shatters when faced with reality. Liberal theology fails to offer any coherent answers when you are standing in front of the mass graves of Bucha or looking at the rubble of a leveled city like Mariupol.
Wow.
It can only offer empty platitudes. It cannot explain the sheer malice. Whereas a rigorous biblical worldview anticipates this exact kind of fallen human behavior. It does not blink in the face of atrocities because it understands what the unregenerate human heart is fully capable of when civil restraints are removed.
So we have established that human conflict stems from a fallen nature. Now, the conversation shifts to how this conflict plays out on the ground in the actual streets, schools, and homes of a nation under fire. The most immediate boundary drawn by a society under threat is the language it speaks.
Yes.
Here is where it gets really interesting. Our first source shares striking statistics from the Razumkov Center gathered in June 2024. 78% of respondents now name Ukrainian as their native language. That is up from 52% back in 2006.
That's a huge jump.
Meanwhile, those naming Russian as their native language dropped from 31% down to just 6%. Additionally, 72% of people use only or mostly Ukrainian outside the home. This is a massive structural shift in how people communicate daily.
It is a staggering demographic realignment. And the sociological source contextualizes this by pointing out reports from Human Rights Watch. When the occupying forces take over a territory, what is the first thing they do?
Right.
They target the language. Russian authorities forced Russian curricula into the local schools. They actively suppressed Ukrainian online classes, they seized and destroyed Ukrainian books, and they made the Russian language a literal loyalty test. Speaking Ukrainian became a punishable act of resistance.
Think about the cognitive friction of that for a second. Imagine you wake up tomorrow and you realize the language you grew up speaking to your mother is now being used by an invading army to justify bombing your neighborhood.
Yeah, that would be terrifying.
You would probably drop that language overnight, too. I look at this linguistic shift almost like an IT department changing a computer network's operating system during an active cyber attack to block a hacker. It is an active defense mechanism. When the invader uses their language to claim you belong to them, switching your language blocks that claim, you are literally unlearning a mother tongue to protect your house.
The human effort required for that shift is monumental. Now, bring in the theological framework from our second source. The text introduces the concept of Babel from Genesis 11. Most people read the story of the Tower of Babel strictly as a story of punishment. Humanity rebelled, so God confused their languages.
Right, like a divine penalty for arrogance.
But the theological text argues it was also an act of severe grace. At Babel, God used language as a judgment, yes, but also as a mechanism to forcibly disperse rebellious humanity to fulfill his original mandate to fill the earth. He prevented them from centralizing their rebellion.
That is a really interesting way to frame it.
And the text also highlights the Greek word ethnos, which appears throughout the New Testament to describe distinct people groups bound by shared customs, lineage, and language. The argument here is that language is a God-ordained boundary marker. It prevents the kind of homogenized imperial tyranny that humans naturally try to build.
The source takes it a step further, making a spiritual comparison, which I found totally fascinating.
It does. The author draws a parallel between a nation rejecting an oppressor's language and the biblical command for believers to separate from theological error or idolatry. The text cites 2 Corinthians 6.17, the call to come out and be separate, and Jude 3, the command to contend earnestly for the faith once delivered to the saints.
So the author is saying that changing your daily vocabulary to a church purging false teaching from its pulpit.
Yes. The theological argument is that rejecting an artificial brotherhood built on subjugation is a legitimate, necessary defense of the boundaries God has appointed for a specific ethnos. It is a rejection of a false unity.
I have to ask a question here, though, and I am genuinely struggling with this part. If a state mandates a language to fight oppression, how do they avoid becoming oppressive to their own citizens?
That is the big question.
Let's be real. There are millions of people in Ukraine who grew up speaking Russian, who still speak Russian, but are fighting in the Ukrainian army right now. They are volunteering, they are delivering supplies, they are bleeding for their country. How does the state mandate a national language without alienating the guy in the trenches whose internal monologue is still in Russian?
That is the tightrope the government has to walk, and the sociological source answers that by calling for civic patience. A state language creates equality when it invites people into a common public sphere.
Yeah.
But the application has to be highly targeted. The policy must target the imperial force of the Russian state apparatus, not the individual citizen.
Give me an example of what that looks like in practice.
It means the state requires Ukrainian competence for public institutions, for the courts, for official documents, and for the education system. That ensures national sovereignty. But it must implement this with humanity. Civic patience means the law does not target a bilingual soldier's prayer in the trenches. It does not target a grandmother's accent in a rural village. It targets the use of language as a weapon of assimilation. You distinguish between the imperial project of the enemy and the complex personal biographies of your own people. You give the population time to adjust their operating system, to use your analogy, rather than punishing them for the hardware they were born with.
Okay, that makes sense. Words define the present boundary of a people. If changing your daily language is how you block the enemy from hacking your present, how do you block them from hacking your past? Because that is the next logical target.
Oh, without a doubt.
They don't just want your streets, they want your history books. We have to look at physical monuments and historical narratives. The physical toll on Ukraine's cultural heritage is massive. Our source notes that UNESCO verified damage to 526 cultural sites by April 2026. This includes museums, religious sites, archives, and libraries.
And we have to pause and consider what a destroyed archive actually means. We're not just talking about a damaged brick building. We're talking about centuries of birth records, marriage certificates, poetry, and local history turned to ash and blowing through the streets.
It's tragic.
The occupiers are actively stealing archives and rewriting history textbooks in the territories they control.
Why focus so heavily on the history textbooks? Why do they care what a fifth grader learns about the 1800s?
Because an occupier understands that controlling the present requires overwriting the past. If you can alter a nation's memory, you manufacture their consent. You convince the children that they never had an independent identity, that they always belonged to the empire. You make the past unintelligible, so the only logical future is submission to the invading force.
Ukraine has responded legislatively to this threat. The source details a 2023 law focused on decolonizing toponymy. Toponymy just means place names, street names, parks, city squares. They are systematically changing geographical markers that honor Russian imperial figures.
Right.
There's also a 2025 law on national memory politics aimed at restoring and preserving a distinct Ukrainian narrative. Think about the physical act of this. Imagine a city worker in a high-visibility vest taking a wrench to a street sign that has honored a Russian general for 100 years, taking it down and putting up a sign honoring a local poet. It is an incredibly visceral act of reclaiming identity.
It is a physical manifestation of a psychological shift.
Yeah.
And the theological text provides a brilliant lens for understanding why this is so critical. The author introduces the Hebrew concept of zakar, which means to remember.
But in the Old Testament, remembering isn't just nostalgia, right? It isn't just looking at an old photograph and feeling sad.
No, zakar is a highly action-oriented word. It is covenantal. In Deuteronomy 5.15, God commands Israel to remember that they were slaves in Egypt and that the Lord brought them out with a mighty hand. This kind of memory dictates future action. Because they remember their deliverance, they must obey the Sabbath. Because they remember they were oppressed, they must treat the foreigner among them with justice. Biblical memory is a demand for covenantal faithfulness.
But the text contrasts that biblical model with the secular model of memory. How does a secular nation build its memory?
The source points out that secular memory often anchors identity in shared historical trauma. For modern Ukraine, that means the Stalin-engineered Holodomor of the 1930s.
Let's touch on that briefly because it is crucial context. The Holodomor was a man-made famine where millions of Ukrainians were deliberately starved to death by the Soviet regime to crush the independence movement and force agricultural collectivization.
Yes, it is a generational scar. And now you add the current siege of cities like Mariupol to that historical ledger. Collective trauma binds a people together. When a nation bleeds together, they remember together, and that shared memory forges their identity as a distinct ethnos. The secular state built monuments to this grief to say, we survived this, therefore we are a people.
Which brings up a very serious challenge. I read this section of the source and I thought, is it possible for a wounded society to rebuild its history without that immense grief turning into blind hatred? Or worse, turning into a new false myth where the nation views itself as entirely flawless?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the theological source offers a severe warning right here. The text brings in John Calvin's concept of the human heart as an idol factory.
An idol factory, meaning we're constantly manufacturing things to worship other than God.
Yes. The author argues that while defending a nation's history against an unjust aggressor is a valid and necessary civil function, there is a massive danger of state idolatry. A wounded nation, bonded by trauma, can easily elevate its own identity, its martyrs, and its historical suffering to the level of a secular religion. They begin to worship the state's survival instead of the creator.
I see it like someone breaking into your home, not just to steal the TV, but to burn all the family photo albums so the children forget who they are. You have to fight the intruder, obviously. But the warning is, do not let your justified defense of your home turn your home into a false god.
Spot on. The source quotes 1 Peter 1.24, noting that all flesh is as grass, and the glory of man is like the flower of grass. The grass withers, and the flower falls away. The monuments of stone erected in any capital city, whether it is Kiev, Moscow, Washington, or London, will eventually crumble to dust.
Right, they all do eventually.
The theological argument is that the trauma of war should point individuals to remember their Creator, as stated in Ecclesiastes 12.1. It should expose the fragility of human existence, rather than convincing a population to place their eternal hope in a national myth. Earthly memory defends the civil society, which is good, but it cannot save the human soul.
So, with language and memory established as the raw materials, the discussion naturally turns to the actual structure being built, the post-occupation nation. But we also have to look at the limits of that earthly structure. Our first source gives us more data from the 2024 Razumkov survey. 91% of respondents are proud of their Ukrainian citizenship. But here is the fascinating part. 46% support a civic definition of the nation, rather than a strict ethnic one.
We should define that difference because it is vital. An ethnic definition says you are only truly part of the nation if you share the specific bloodline, the specific ancestral heritage.
Right, which historically leads to all sorts of horrific exclusion. A civic definition, however, includes Russian-speaking patriots, Crimean Tatars, Jews, Roma, and anyone else who shares loyalty to the state and its democratic values. The fact that nearly half the country supports a civic definition in the middle of an existential war is incredibly revealing.
That civic inclusion is vital for their survival. It prevents the society from fracturing from the inside. But the practical difficulties of deoccupation are massive. As areas are liberated by the military, the state has to come in and establish justice. They have to distinguish between leadership collaboration with the enemy and coerced survival.
Put the listener in those shoes for a second. Imagine you are a utility worker in a town that got occupied. You kept the water running so your neighbors wouldn't die of thirst, but to do that, you had to take a paycheck from the occupying Russian authority.
Yeah, you didn't have a choice.
Or imagine you are a school teacher who kept teaching math just to give the kids some sense of normalcy, but an armed soldier was standing in the hallway making sure you used their approved textbook. When the Ukrainian army liberates that town, how does the state judge you? Are you a traitor? Or did you just do what you had to do to feed your family under threat of death?
It is an incredibly difficult ethical and legal knot to untangle. You are trying to rebuild a cohesive society where some people actively hid flags and sabotaged the enemy, and others took Russian passports simply to get access to insulin at the pharmacy. The state has to establish a perimeter of safety and justice that accounts for that massive gray area.
So, what does this all mean? I compare this nation-building effort to setting up a neighborhood watch perimeter. You organize your neighbors, you set up rules, you secure the borders of your street, and you identify the threats. It provides crucial physical safety for all the residents on the street. It is a good and necessary thing. But that neighborhood watch perimeter does absolutely nothing to cure terminal illness inside one of the houses. The physical security does not solve the internal decay.
That is a brilliant comparison. The theological source overlays this exact dynamic with Augustine's famous distinction between the earthly city and the city of God. Augustine wrote about this while Rome was literally falling to the Visigoths. The earthly city, the civil government, is necessary for temporal justice. It restrains evil, it pays the roads, it runs the courts. But it is passing away. It is temporary. The city of God, comprised of the redeemed, is eternal.
And the source gets very specific about this theology, right? It outlines a dispensational and premillennial view. Let's break those terms down so we don't lose anyone.
Let's do that. In broad terms, a dispensational premillennial view argues that God has distinct plans for national Israel and for the New Testament church. They are not the same entity. Therefore, the church is completely distinct from any earthly nation.
So, under this view, no modern secular nation acts as the earthly kingdom of God. Not Ukraine, not Russia, not the United States, not the United Kingdom. None of them hold a special divine covenant status like Old Testament Israel did.
Correct. Which means you cannot conflate political victory with spiritual victory. The source uses a very specific theological analogy here regarding boundary markers. He uses the analogy of believers' baptism.
Wait, how does baptism connect to geopolitics?
Well, in that theological tradition, baptism is a visible boundary marker. It separates the justified believer from the unregenerate world. It is a public declaration of a spiritual reality. The author argues that the rejection of Soviet monuments and Russian cultural hegemony acts as a physical, geopolitical boundary marker for the Ukrainian people. Tearing down a statue of Lenin separates the oppressed from the oppressor in the visible earthly realm.
I'm struggling with this part, though. You were saying political liberation does not equal spiritual salvation. But to the guy in the trenches who just got his town back, isn't that freedom enough for right now? How does the text justify telling someone holding a newly reclaimed passport that they are still fundamentally in need of rescue?
Because the text makes a fierce rejection of what it calls the social gospel.
The idea that fixing society's problems, poverty, war, inequality, is the actual gospel.
Yes. The author clarifies that political liberation is a massive civil good, but it is not spiritual salvation. You can secure the borders of your nation, you can establish the most just court system in history, but the unregenerate heart of every citizen is still, as Ephesians 2:2 describes, operating under the prince who rules the air. The theological argument is that true freedom, eternal freedom, requires the imputed righteousness of Christ.
Let's define imputed righteousness really quick.
It means that a person cannot generate their own perfection or their own right standing before God, no matter how bravely they fought for their country. They need the perfect righteousness of Jesus Christ credited to their account, received by faith alone. Escaping a human dictator does not exempt an individual from standing before the righteous judgment of the Creator. You can be politically free and spiritually dead at the exact same time.
Pulling back from the immediate policy challenges, we need to take a macro view of human history. We are witnessing an incredible historical moment right now. International groups like the Council of Europe and the UN Human Rights Office are watching this unfold in real time. Think about the stakes.
The stakes are huge.
If Ukraine succeeds, it proves a society can throw off massive imperial domination without resorting to vicious ethnic exclusivity. It proves they can build a functioning democratic state based on shared civic values and a reclaimed language, even while under fire.
It would be a monumental achievement in the civil sphere. But the theological source brings the entire conversation to its climax by looking past the current century. The author mentions historical figures like Charles Spurgeon and Paul Washer to point out the absolute transience of all earthly empires.
The graveyard of empires.
Yes, think about the Babylonian Empire, the Roman Empire, the Soviet machine. They all built massive structures. They birthed them with the blood and sweat of the oppressed. They seemed invincible in their prime, and they were all swept away by divine justice. They are dust.
It is like watching people proudly building massive, intricate sandcastles on the beach, completely ignoring the fact that the tide is already coming in. The arrogance of invading empires assumes their borders, their tanks, and their language mandates will last forever. But the tide of divine providence always washes them out.
This brings in the crucial theological distinction between the law and the gospel. The source argues that the horrors of war act as the terrifying megaphone of God's law.
Explain that. How does a bombing raid act as a megaphone for the law?
Because war exposes the absolute bankruptcy of humanistic optimism. The law demands perfect love for God and neighbor. War is the ultimate visible proof that humanity utterly fails that standard. It proves that human nature is fatally flawed and that no amount of earthly government, education, or diplomacy can eradicate evil.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The law crushes any hope we have in our own inherent goodness.
Yeah.
When you see a destroyed hospital, you are seeing the indisputable evidence of total depravity.
It strips away the illusion that we are just a few policy tweaks away from a utopia. So, if the law crushes us by exposing our depravity through the reality of war, what does the source offer as the solution?
The gospel. The text points to substitutionary atonement as the sole source of true peace.
Substitutionary atonement, meaning Jesus Christ stepping in as a substitute, taking the divine wrath and punishment that our depravity earned so that we can be reconciled to God.
Yes, the author directs the reader toward the pre-tribulational, premillennial return of Christ. The text references Isaiah 2.4, looking forward to the literal day when the true king returns, judges the nations with perfect equity, and swords are finally beaten into plowshares. True, lasting geopolitical peace only arrives when the Prince of Peace physically reigns.
I want to make this intensely practical for the person listening right now. When you, the listener, look at the evening news and you see borders changing violently, cities turn to rubble, and political leaders threatening nuclear escalation, what should your internal reaction be? How do we process that without falling into despair or political fanaticism?
This raises an interesting question about how we process current events through a biblical lens. The theological source concludes that we should experience a dual reality. On one hand, Romans 13 validates the desire for earthly justice. It is right to support the defense of the vulnerable. It is right to want civil authorities to punish evildoers. It is right to want an oppressed nation to achieve liberty and secure its borders. We should advocate for justice in the earthly city.
So we don't just check out and say, well, it's all burning anyway, who cares?
No, fatalism is not a biblical option. But simultaneously, there must be a total reliance on the gospel, realizing that earthly citizenship is just a vapor. It vanishes. The courage on a battlefield, while incredibly honorable in the civil sphere, cannot atone for sins against the Creator. The listener should feel a deep compassion for the physical suffering of the oppressed, coupled with an urgent recognition that every human being needs the gospel of Jesus Christ above all else.
We have covered incredible ground today. Synthesizing these texts reveals a massive duality in how we view the world. On the physical earthly level, a nation must secure its language, evidence its history, and protect its citizens to survive.
Yeah, they have to.
The sociological data we looked at proves that Ukraine is doing exactly this. They are reclaiming words, tearing down imperial monuments, and trying to balance the demands of justice with the necessity of civic inclusion. It is a historic effort.
And yet simultaneously, the theological framework acts as a mirror, held up to that sociological data. All human conflict, every destroyed building, and every rewritten textbook shows humanity's desperate, unavoidable need for an eternal king. The earthly struggle is a vivid, tragic illustration of the underlying spiritual condition.
The boundaries of language and the monuments of memory are absolutely necessary for survival today. We need them to function, but they offer no eternal security. I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, lingering thought to ponder as you step back into your day, whether you are driving, working, or just sitting at home.
It's a heavy thought.
We've spent this time analyzing the physical and cultural monuments an entire nation is fighting to secure against overwhelming odds. But when the monuments of our current generation, the governments, the borders, the street signs, eventually turn to dust, as all empires do, what are the invisible, eternal monuments you are building in your own life today? Are you trusting in the fragile sandcastles of earthly security, or are you resting in the finished work of Christ? Thank you for pulling up a chair and joining this session. Until next time.